We're joined from Melbourne by Evan Mulholland from the Institute of Public Affairs and Sam Crosby from the McKell Institute. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning, both of you.
So, Sam, what are your thoughts on this? We've got a trial being rolled out in Western Sydney, one coming in Brisbane and also Perth. We've heard a lot from various parties saying this is simply not going to help, although there is some support saying perhaps this is a way to be more effective in dealing with people with those problems.
Yeah, I think the support comes from the Liberal Party pollsters. This is a program designed to be popular. Like, that's what it is. No drug evidence expert, no welfare expert has put their name to this program to say, yes, the evidence is in and it will help people. The only places in the United States where this has been rolled out has shown an absolute abject failure. And it's not just a sort of benign failure where the money could be and should be better spent elsewhere on other harm minimisation programs to actually get people off drugs and treat them better. It's actually a malicious program. It further isolates and ostracises people on welfare programs who might have drug problems. It's not just a benign problem here.
So, Evan Mulholland, is this just simply perhaps a cost-cutting measure and a drive for popularity with looking at rolling out these trials?
Look, I'm pretty indifferent to this. I think there's a general expectation from the taxpayer that if their taxpayers' money is going to go to welfare, it be used both efficiently and effectively. Only last week, my IPA colleague Gideon Rosner released a report that found that 1 in 5 working-age Australian men are either out of work or not looking for work at all once you take into account the work-to-population ratio. I'm not surprised by polling that finds the majority of Australians support this. To be honest, I'm a little uncomfortable as a small government guy with government infringing on people's liberties like this, but I think the government does have a genuine interest in trying to get people off the welfare cycle into work, and they are looking to and see New Zealand as a role model who've introduced a vast range of welfare reforms with the sole focus of getting people off welfare into work.
So, Evan, you're saying you're a little conflicted there in that you're saying you'd like to see smaller government, but you feel as though perhaps the government does have an obligation to make sure their money is being well spent.
Yeah, exactly. Taxpayers expect efficiency and expect people on welfare to be using that money efficiently. We've seen other programs like the debit welfare card, which also I'm a little uncomfortable with, but have had some success. So I would stress that it is a trial. If the government finds it doesn't work, then they could quite easily scrap it or amend it, or if it finds it does work, roll it out to the general public. But I think it's only a few locations at the moment to see how it goes in Australia.
Interesting to note as well, Sam, we've seen an article in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning where a survey of people in the Canterbury Bankstown area of Western Sydney has asked people what they think, particularly those people who are currently receiving welfare payments. And on the whole, in the article, it looks like those people who are most likely to be affected are actually in favour of it. So Is this not a measure then that may see some positive outcomes?
No, look, it's a positive move. Bashing people in the dole has always been a positive move. Like every politician, left, right, centre, we get that, right? The question though is, if you actually want to do, as Evan says, if you actually want to have a positive impact in this area, and we should give the politicians the benefit of the doubt. If you actually want to do that, there are a range of programs out there that are tried and tested, and every expert will line up behind them and say, here's how you fix them. This is not one of them. It has never been one of them. So, and look, in the United States case, 0.01% of people were found to have drug dependence, drugs in their system. So it doesn't surprise me that people, on welfare programs, surprise, can't afford drugs and aren't actually drug users. It doesn't mean that they're not being unfairly maligned in this whole process, though, by having politician after politician get up there and say, oh, we know you're on drugs, come clean.
All right, let's now turn to another big talking point of the week, statues. Now, this essentially came about by what happened in the United States as far as moves to tear down Confederate history in the form of statues. Now we're looking at Australia, and Stan Grant had the article earlier in the week saying that we do need to look at this. He's not advocating for these statues to be torn down from people such as James Cook and Governor Phillip. And in fact, I should mention this morning we do have news that a statue of Cook and Governor Phillip have both been defaced I think they've written change the date. There we go. We've got some images there.
Because, of course, that feeds into the debate about Australia Day and whether or not we should change the date from the 26th of January. That's also been an ongoing debate, and various councils around the country have made moves to either not mark Australia Day with particular celebrations or, in fact, to change citizenship ceremonies on that date.
Yeah, that's right. It has opened up a large conversation. Evan, do you think... is it a conversation that we need to have?
I think it's important to recognise that statues represent a moment in time. With the Captain Cook statue, it represents and symbolises the British discovery of Australia by the British as a British interpretation. I think looking to the United States, some of the things we're seeing are shocking. You've got a far-left activist movement like Antifa trying to wash a 21st century politically correct agenda over the past. I think that's really sad, because statues are knowledge, and knowledge can be passed on to future generations regardless if it's good or bad. Thankfully in Australia things are a lot more tempered. No one's calling for statues to be removed. Even Keith Windschuttle said that we could come to some sort of compromise whereby we could have an acknowledgement, an additional plaque saying that, of course, Indigenous people were here tens of thousands of years beforehand. It is taught in schools that Indigenous people were here tens of thousands of years beforehand. I'm the kind of person that thinks we should have more statues, not less. We should recognise the great institutions of Western civilisation and the British institutions like liberal democracy and rule of law that have made Australia great. And there is a lot of correlation between the Australia Day debate. I think we can have a bit of both. We can both recognise the British institutions that have made Australia great and also acknowledge the shared history and tragedies of our past.
Sam, how do you think we should approach this issue? And of course, it does come to a question of how does Australia reconcile Indigenous and non-Indigenous? And, you know, the question of Australia Day, historical figures such as Captain James Cook and the idea of discovery. How do we allow for inclusive and reconciling conversation around that?
Yeah, so I think going back to where this conversation started last week in the Confederate example, these statues are there lionising people who weren't patriots. They took up arms against their government in support of slavery, and that's what they're there for. Now, in the case that Donald Trump said, oh, well, let's tear down the statues of Jefferson and Washington because they owned slaves. Well, there's a big difference between being complicit in a problem and actively propagating that problem. And that's the difference that we need to recognise. So to come to the Captain Cook example, look, he's not there as an example of someone who has presided over the massacre and the genocide of Australia's first people. That's not what he's there for. And as Evan points out, from the British's perspective, he discovered Australia. And that's okay to say, you know, here's this guy's an incredibly significant figure for a lot of Australians. But to take Stan Grant's point, I think he's absolutely right. The date on the plaques to say that, you know, he discovered Australia in 1788, it's obviously wrong. You know, it's just historically, demonstrably wrong. So we do need to correct those plaques and have some sort of an explanation there.
Well, I guess in context, Europeans discovered it on that date.
Sure.
But of course, Indigenous people tens of thousands of years earlier. Are you of the view, perhaps as Evan pointed out there, and even various historians saying, perhaps we should simply amend those statues and have more statues that include Indigenous history?
Yeah, exactly. And similarly with the Australia Day debate, I think when Australia becomes a republic, as will ultimately happen at some stage, I think that would be a great date to change Australia Day to the day we actually become a fully fledged republic of our own. Until that point, I think one of the things that we need to do is celebrate Indigenous culture with a public holiday of its own. You know, I don't think we need the Queen's birthday. I don't think, you know, we need half the holidays that we have, and yet we have them. And we celebrate the Anzacs on Anzac Day as we should. We celebrate the Labor movement on Labor Day as we should. You know, I think having an Aboriginal Australia Day where we celebrate Eddie Mabo or any of the Wick decision, the Wick people, you know, I think there's a whole range of different things that you can celebrate to highlight the really positive role that Indigenous culture has had in Australia for the last 200 years, and obviously a long way before that.
Evan, do we need to change the date for Australia Day?
No, I don't think so. I think we can both recognise the history of our past and tragedies that have happened to the Indigenous people, and also celebrate what makes Australia great in a really unifying way. I think campaigns like Change the Date are a symbol to remove the great histories of Western civilization by the West itself. I don't think we need to. I think it'll be a retrograde step for Australia.
All right, now let's just finish on another very interesting yet controversial note. Yesterday, it was revealed after Annabelle Crabb, in her series, spoke to Tony Abbott. And he has now admitted that he missed a crucial vote during the GFC. This was the Labor government trying to increase emergency spending, which the opposition was resisting. He missed that vote because, he says, he now admits, he was drunk. He was passed out. Evan, sorry, Sam, but does that surprise you? Well, obviously it's surprising everyone.
It is surprising. Look, I'm not one of these Puritans that's, oh my God, someone's drunk at work, this is outrageous, you know. Like, I think when you look at...
I mean, what other workplace do you get away with being drunk?
Well, but to be fair, I mean, this was a long sitting day, it was after dinner, it was late at night, so I do look at it with one lens, saying, oh, give the guy a break. But then with the other eye, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, how blackout, blind drunk do you need to be where you've got the whip trying to rouse you, you've got the bells going off, and you can't muster yourself to splash some water on your face, walk down to the chamber and sit. I mean, he didn't have to speak, he didn't have to say anything, he just had to sit down on one side of the aisle. I mean, that's pretty blind drunk.
Evan, what does this say, not just about Tony Abbott, but about the way that our parliament either functions or perhaps doesn't function as it should?
Yeah, look, I think people will look at this and see a human element to this. I agree with Sam. Sitting days can be very long. Having worked in the Abbott and Turnbull government, sometimes you go in before 6 o'clock and you don't leave till very late at night, and our politicians are held to a higher standard. At the same time, I think it's right for Malcolm Turnbull to say it's unacceptable. If you saw that happen in this parliament with the numbers so tight, you would get an absolute scalding. But I think the public will look at this and see a human element to our politicians. It was unacceptable that he would just close his eyes and open his eyes and it be morning. I think it doesn't set a very good example, but we can't expect our politicians to be held in such high standard as to never make any mistakes.
Evan, are you surprised not so much with what happened, but the fact that he's actually admitted to it?
Yeah, he's admitted to it a long time later as well, I think 6 years after the date. And he did have stories by Shari Markson at the time claiming that he was drunk and fiercely denied them. So I found it very interesting that 6 years later he finally admits to it. And
forced Wayne Swan to withdraw a comment when he raised it in the Parliament saying that he was blind drunk. Forced him to withdraw that comment at the time. So I think that little bit of the hypocrisy there is a little bit galling.
Well, certainly Wayne Swan expressed his outrage yesterday.
Yes. I'm not sure you've heard the last of this, but we will have to leave this conversation now. Evan Mulholland in Melbourne, Sam Crosby in Sydney. Wonderful to have you both joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.